Good morning, this is Ottolina English channel and I am Gabriele Germani. I interviewed Joseph Gregory Mahoney, a university professor and expert on Chinese socialism. How might Trump's recent victory affect on USA and China relationship? Some say he'll adopt a pragmatic, less interventionist strategy. Do you agree?
I think we have to be very cautious with Trump. I don't think that Trump himself really knows what his agenda will be. I think there's good reason to believe that when he first took power in his first term, that he was largely being guided by the Pentagon on some of his foreign policy initiatives. And if that's the case, and if that continues, certainly we saw in his first administration he was requiring a number of exceptions to bring generals into his administration. There's a restriction on senior military officials joining the presidential administration directly. They have to get a Senate exception. So there's really two sort of points here, two different threads of analysis. On the one hand, we have what is clear, a sense of continuity from late Obama to Trump to Biden, and so we might question the extent to which Trump was setting the table for Biden, and if it's not Trump, then was it someone in the Pentagon or some other geostrategic think tank or group within the U.S. government that was responsible for this. On the other hand, it's also clear that there is a strong possibility that Trump would move in a different direction than Biden, and this could be indicated for two reasons. First, it may be the case that Trump was always inclined to a different direction. We have to recall that Trump did ultimately negotiate a trade deal with China, but that fell apart due to the pandemic and due to him losing the re-election. Additionally, even if Harris had won the election, we would have anticipated whichever new administration took power, that they would be putting in place some tactical adjustments. I think it's rather clear that Biden's doctrine or the Biden strategy was already starting to fail, despite the tremendous success that it seems to have accumulated in terms of its ability to pressure China on various fronts. I think it was also clear that that was never ultimately going to work out, that they pushed that as far as they could. And I think one of the clear indicators there was the fact that India was never really corralled, and India was maybe the linchpin of the Indo-Pacific and certainly some of the other containment objectives. So the Biden doctrine was failing, and we were already seeing possibly that there was going to be some differences with the Harris administration. So, there is an opening for change. Is Trump really an isolationist? Is he someone who might, for example, pull U.S. forces back from the Philippines, pull U.S. special forces back from Taiwan, stop the deployment of missiles into the Philippines? It's possible, but I think we should, again, take some caution because I'm not sure that he really knows what he's going to do. But at the same time, whatever he would do, I don't think it would be something that he would do automatically. Like we will see on the afternoon that he's inaugurated, he will go straight to the White House and sign dozens of executive orders. This is what presidents do now because Congress is so impotent. The U.S. is really being governed through the Supreme Court and through executive orders of the White House. So he will do that, but I don't think he will focus on giving away certain things to China. I think he will try to use some of the leverage that Biden has given him as points for renegotiating a new trade deal or some other outcome. I don't think Trump is looking for a defeat of China the way Biden was, but Trump is definitely looking for a win. He wants to win some sort of negotiation, or this is part of his political brand. And certainly, I think he will be facing a lot of pressure from business interests who also want to have a win in terms of improved trade relations with China. Now, there is some speculation that certainly Trump would, fundamentally shift the U.S. position on Ukraine. In fact, that was coming regardless. That conflict has been stalemated for more than a year, both the United States and Russia. If we follow the idea that I've been advancing, at least, that these are two fossil fuel dependent economies fighting a proxy war over control of energy markets and how energy is paid for, I would argue that both Russia and the United States achieved their strategic objectives a year and a half ago. Why hasn't the conflict ended so far? In part because Biden was so politically invested in it that there was no way it was going to end before he left office. And certainly, it's also the case that and this again is based on my field work in Ukraine last year, that the political situation in Ukraine itself is so fragmented that it's very difficult for them to come to a consensus position from which to negotiate. So there's this political crisis in Ukraine itself, which is compounded by the fact that Zelensky's mandate has run out. He's overstayed his term in office. And there was already considerable dissent among Ukrainians about whether or not he was really going to be able to see this through to the end, or whether or not he was the real power, whether or not there were other, oligarchic or other forces that were really calling the shots there. So there's a political crisis in Ukraine that has been covered up to some extent by the unresolved conflict. But I think once Biden is out, Trump will move in some way to pull the U.S. back, and then I think Europe will have to decide what its commitment will be, whether it's individual countries like Poland or the Baltics or some others who feel very emotionally invested in this conflict, whether or not they're going to continue to support, whether other European countries are going to continue to support with weapons or financial aid, and then ultimately whether Europe will want to take the tremendous risk of trying to bring Ukraine into the EU or some other type of arrangement. I don't foresee Ukraine being admitted to the United States in a Trump administration. I think if we're familiar with what the term pragmatism means in political philosophy, I don't think we would use this word. And I think it's a word that we use in vernacular, but I don't think Trump is a pragmatist. I think that Trump is a populist who is exploiting a certain type of hyper-reality in U.S. politics at this time, which above all is masking the simple fact that the U.S. is in decline, and that the U.S. depends on trying to sustain a hegemonic position, above all related to the dollar. It's not clear to me that Trump really understands economics. It's not clear to me that he really understands what tariffs do. So, this idea that he would slap tariffs on China, that this would somehow fix the problem. The fact of the matter is, in China, a lot of businesses like Trump because they think that he was a lot less dangerous to China than Biden was, that Chinese businesses were able to learn a lesson from Trump, that they needed to strengthen their position, that they needed to get ready for increased conflict, but that Trump was causing more trouble to the U.S. than he was causing for China. So this was ultimately a net positive. So I don't think in this sense we can call him a pragmatist. I think he's an opportunist. I think he's a reactionary. But I don't think he has a real clear idea of economics and geopolitics.
Could Brazil's veto against Venezuela joining BRICS indicate a strategic alignment with China? Does this suggest a possible opening toward the USA and support for peace in Ukraine?
Well, there is a misperception, I think, in the West that Russia and China are in lockstep with each other. They're certainly not. But in China, there are two things to keep in mind, at least from the Chinese perspective. The first is the Chinese idiom of emphasizing common ground while reserving differences. And second is that China, understanding why China has a strong strategic relationship with Russia. And in this case, it's good just to review this quickly. The first is one of the major threats to China is the presence of U.S. nuclear missile submarines under the Arctic ice. These boats can tether themselves under the ice. They don't have to hold position in the Pacific. Under the ice, they are halfway to China. In other words, the missiles that we have in Missouri or other parts of the U.S., if you're under the ice in Arctic, you're already halfway to China or to Russia. And so they're really hard to stop. And then under the ice, it's more difficult for the satellites to see them. They don't produce a signature that the satellites might be able to see. So one of the problems is that it's really difficult for the Chinese hunter subs to get up under the ice to map these boats. So this is really the only way you can try to mitigate this threat. And the reason for this is that the U.S. enacted an underwater submarine net just off the Chinese coast. So anytime the Chinese subs leave the sub bases, they get picked up and tracked by the U.S. And if the Chinese subs start getting close to the American subs, the Americans move. So the only way that China can mitigate this threat is to partner with Russia. And so this is something that they've done and they have to continue to do. Another thing that we know is that starting with the first Gulf War with the United States in the Middle East, that the U.S. was building a major imperial footprint in the Middle East in order to be able to shut off the flow of oil in case of conflicts. And this is what forced China to start being more aggressive in looking for other sources, including in Africa, but also building a stronger energy relationship with Russia. So this is a strategic necessity. With the second war in Iraq and in Afghanistan, this is where the United States penetrated Central Asia, built air bases through former Soviet republics. And at the high point of that penetration, the U.S. had effectively encircled China with conventional weapons, and by some estimates could hit any target inside of China with conventional weapons inside of 15 minutes. Now, strategists had said that this was very important because China has a no nuclear first doctrine, and China has always been vulnerable to security risks coming from Central Asia, given the placement of their space and oil industries in Xinjiang and the third and fourth defensive lines out in the Chinese West. So it was very important for China to work through building up the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in partnership with Russia, because Russia was the historic hegemon in that region. And if China was to start really moving much more assertively in Central Asia, it would have to do that in tandem with Russia to prevent conflict with Russia. And so that's precisely what they did. They built that relationship and managed to incentivize those former Soviet republics pushing those American air bases out. Of course, China and Russia, they share a long border. It's important for them to continue to cooperate in these respects. And of course, they also are partners in BRICS. And we're not quite clear the extent to which Russia has helped mediate improved relations between China and India. There are competing analyses on this, but we do know that relations have improved between these two countries. And whether or not Russia was playing an active role, the fact that Russia was in BRICS is something that would have encouraged India and other countries to participate that and then to envision a future of some form of solidarity or peaceful development with China. And perhaps that's what we're seeing mature at this point. That said, there are some other positions that I think we can raise, but I don't think we can draw conclusions from. For example, earlier this year, when President Xi was meeting the leaders from the Central Asian countries, President Putin went to Pyongyang and to Hanoi. And for some observers, this was sort of a warning to China that China was maybe becoming a little too strong in Central Asia and not involving Russia in, say, this summit with Central Asian leaders. And so Putin was therefore interested in inserting Russia into the Korean Peninsula issue, which they had largely abdicated and left to China, which has then, I think, contributed to concerns that Russia taking a more activist stance, Russia bringing North Korean troops into at least into a support role with the conflict in Ukraine and buying weapons from North Korea, but then also taking a strong position on the U.S. placement of advanced missile systems in the Philippines, that this may be where Russia is trying to play itself into this role in East Asia in ways that would perhaps invite more stress or pressure ultimately to China, because we know that the advanced missiles that were put in South Korea many years ago, that this was something that really destabilized relations between China and South Korea. And we know that Biden, with his anti-China containment policy, had returned nuclear missile visits to South Korea. So there's this sort of complex game. And then, of course, in Hanoi, in Vietnam, you have the history of the Soviet Union and Vietnam in a strategic partnership that led to a complete breakdown in relations between China and Vietnam and China and the Soviet Union. Now, I think that this is prone to a bit of overinterpretation, but some people believe that that's what Putin was signaling, that he was warning Beijing that they needed to tread a little more softly in Central Asia. But the key point here is that I think that both countries have compelling reasons to maintain a strategic partnership, but they also have competing interests. And I'll name one, a really big one that, and for me in my work, I think it's the most profound difference, is that Russia is a country of the global north. And Russia is, President Putin has said on numerous occasions that climate change is good for Russia, right? And climate change is devastating for China. It's hollowing out China from the inside in terms of desertification. And then in the coastal regions in Shandong, Jiangsu, Shanghai, and Guangdong, we have 3 of the top 5 most vulnerable places in the world in terms of exposed populations and fixed capital investment. And so this is where clearly these two countries are in a major point of difference. But in terms of how China views the world, in terms of what's the principal contradiction, certainly China is working to mitigate the effects of climate change. But for the meantime, they must have a strong partnership with Russia in order to deal with the other more present threats to Chinese sovereignty and security.
Some Western analysts see BRICS as dominated by China. Do you think this is accurate?
Well, I know that the official Chinese position is that it's a partnership and that China does not play a dominant role, but I certainly think that Chinese major country diplomacy, that it's principles-based diplomacy, that these are really, in some ways, the instrumental heart and soul or driving force of a lot of the values associated not only with BRICS but also with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now, I think that one of the things that we point out is that BRICS is sort of a counterbalance to the G7, and that BRICS in tandem with the G20 is, BRICS becomes sort of an organizing committee for countries that have something in common, so that when they start working within the G20, they're aligned in terms of what they're doing with those other G7 countries that are part of the G20. So this is sort of just to draw an analogy, this is sort of a Chinese communist model. You organize and you get your people together first, and you have some consensus, and then you go into whatever larger political meeting, and then you try to push through your agenda. Now, I'm not saying that this is a Chinese communist, that's what BRICS is, but I'm saying this is this is the sort of method that we would see being used in China itself. I think, though, that what is important to me is to understand how BRICS is positively correlated with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, how BRICS has a positive relationship with the Belt Road Initiative, how it has a positive relationship with several other initiatives originating out of China, one of which being the Global Development Initiative, which is trying to pick up and push forward the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Goals that fell behind due to the pandemic. This is located in the United Nations itself. The United Nations is sacrosanct to China. China doesn't want to do anything to compromise this multilateral organization, and certainly it's building all of these multilateral organizations not to undermine the UN, but to strengthen multilateralism. China has been pushing for reforms in the United Nations, but has been thwarted by some of the other leading countries. So China is trying to build more pure or genuine multilateral organizations in some of these mini-lateralisms, and then build a sort of consensus within that to then push reforms perhaps through some of these larger, more global organizations, which unfortunately have become gridlocked and impotent, as we've seen in a number of increasing conflicts. But there are other things that China is trying to do. For example, the way it's supporting UN peacekeeping, the way it's pushing the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative. All of these things belong to a comprehensive vision of what President Xi describes as a shared future for humanity, but it's one in which people have to be living according to the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. So this, I think that if we just focus on BRICS, then we lose sight of the much bigger picture that China is trying to encourage. And although China is a major player in these efforts, China understands that this will only work by building consensus and building real partnerships where other people are willing to shoulder the burden, and it's not just a Chinese solution. Because let's be clear, China doesn't want to solve anyone's problems except its own. I don't mean that China wants to abdicate responsibility for global climate change. Certainly, that's sort of a collective issue. That is a problem for China. But I mean, China doesn't want to solve your problems in Italy. They don't want to rule Italy. They don't want to be a hegemon in the sense that the U.S. was, or maybe, as some people would argue, the Soviet Union had a tendency towards. China wants everyone to take a responsibility for ruling themselves, and ruling themselves well, with the understanding that if you do that, we'll have greater security, greater trade relations, and be able to work together to solve existential problems like climate change or new black swan events like the pandemic.
What role can China play in resolving conflicts in the Middle East, such as its mediation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, or its infrastructure projects in the region?
So I think you've hit on the major points there. Certainly, China is playing a more important role in trying to reconcile longtime foes. You have noted, for example, the important role that it played in trying to reconcile Riyadh and Tehran. And certainly we have seen Beijing take a positive step forward in reconciling the Palestinian factions. Now, I hear criticism of China that China is somehow culpable because China has not resolved the conflict in Palestine. This is kind of absurd. I don't want to condemn anyone. I think we all know that, if you want to oppose Israel is a nuclear-armed country. It's a country that is supported by the United States. We understand that this is sort of a perverse favoritism, and that if you oppose Israel, Israel will come and get you, and if they can't get the job done, then the U.S. will finish it for them. So I think everyone is very cautious in terms of how they engage. I think in China's case, China looks at other countries in the region and looks at their inability to deal with the problem. These include the Arab countries, but also Turkey. So a lot of people say a lot of critical things, but they haven't actually done a lot of things. And so why is it therefore China's responsibility to enter into a region and take responsibility for a conflict that it has no historical responsibility for. Again, China's position is that one should not play this type of activist or interventionist role in conflicts, but rather should try to facilitate diplomatic solutions. I think China has tried to do that, but certainly has run into just this incredible decision, this incredibly dark decision by the Zionists to advance a genocide, and just the horrible reality that the U.S. has accommodated this. It's really difficult, I think, to do more than China has done at this point to address this issue. But certainly, I think China has made it clear that they want peace in the region. I know that we go back to the early 1980s. The number one thing that Chinese strategic planners were worried about is that the Soviet Union would eventually fall, and that the Soviet base in Syria would fall, and that this would open the door to U.S. penetration of Central Asia. And of course, that didn't happen. Unfortunately, the Americans came through Pakistan into Afghanistan, and then that created, of course, part of the reasons for building the strategic alliance with Russia to push those forces out. So China is very interested in finding a resolution to those conflicts. I think if we look very closely, for example, at some of the Belt Road maps, it's obvious that part of it should be going through Syria at some point. So I think China does have a comprehensive vision for a future peace and peaceful development, and is eager for that to move along. But there are a lot of forces that are not only resisting resolving some of the immediate conflicts, but are probably also looking for ways to frustrate that future vision that China has in mind as well.